the Russian targets and the latest EU sanctions, which have now come to light. The latest restrictions tighten the screw on 5 Russian state-owned banks already under sanctions. The length of the loans they now can get from Europe has been reduced to 30 days. Igor Piskunov explains who else is on the new hit list.
The new set of sanctions targets Russia's largest oil companies, including Rosneft, Gazpromneft, and Transneft. And from now on, they'll have more problems getting access to Western funds, since Western banks are being banned from giving them loans exceeding 30 days. These Russian energy companies will also have no access now to Western deep-water oil exploration technologies, which could affect a lot of important projects, including the ones in the Arctic. Western companies are also being banned from exporting so-called dual-use technologies. That doesn't only affect the energy sector, but companies like the Kalashnikov arms producer as well. We also know that 24 more Russian citizens have been added onto the Western blacklists. Now, this is the European Union set of sanctions. We're also waiting for the United States to announce its set of sanctions later on Friday, and it is expected that they will target Russia's largest state banks. Now, the timing of these sanctions has been raising a lot of questions, since the main argument that we're hearing from Western officials is that they're supposed to force Moscow change its policies on Ukraine. But currently there's a ceasefire going on in southeastern Ukraine, which Moscow has been actively promoting. And also the other thing is that Russia, will now have to wait for Russia's reaction, since many officials here have been warning there will be one in case a new set of anti-Russian sanctions takes place.
Well, the 3 energy giants sanctioned by the EU on Friday account for the lion's share of the production and handling of crude oil in Russia. Rosneft isn't only the country's #1 oil producer, it's also one of the biggest in the world and is worth an estimated $60 billion. Gazpromneft is the 4th largest producer of oil in Russia and is said to be worth some $10 billion, while Transneft, which transports most of Russia's oil, is the biggest mover of the crude in the entire world. The EU's ploughing ahead with yet more sanctions, though, against Russia, despite the peace efforts in East Ukraine. President Putin's spokesman described Brussels' moves as astonishing.
This decision can't be understood on the background of Russia's efforts to contribute to a peaceful resolution of the conflict in southeast Ukraine. In this case, it is obvious for us that Brussels either does not see or stubbornly refuses to see the real situation in Donbass, and does not want to have information about the steps that have been taken for peaceful conflict resolution.
Let's get reaction now with Marcus Papadopoulos, an historian and publisher and editor of Politics First magazine. Thanks very much for coming onto the programme for us. I think we've got him. Here he is, Mr. Papadopoulos. Look, we're hearing now that the US president says that these latest sanctions are being implemented because of Russia's efforts to destabilise Ukraine, and yet Russia is the country to have backed the ceasefire. So how does that weigh up?
Well, the American government has been playing a duplicitous role in Ukraine. The war in eastern Ukraine was America's war, and it was a war that was instigated by the American government for 2 reasons. Firstly, to bring Ukraine into the West's sphere of influence, for it to eventually join the European Union and for it to join NATO and thereby encircle Russia completely on its western borders in Europe. And the second reason was to justify a permanent NATO presence in Eastern Europe. The Americans are acutely aware that the Russia of today is not the Russia of the 1990s. Russia today is strong politically, economically and militarily, and the American government feels very threatened by that. So that's why the Americans are pushing ahead with these sanctions as a way of attempting to cripple a resurgent Russia on the international stage.
But in terms of what's happening on the ground, we're hearing today that the prisoner swap has gone ahead as planned. So these are obvious steps, aren't they, towards peace? How can Mr. Obama then come out and say Ukraine is still aiming, or sorry, Russia is still aiming to destabilise Ukraine?
Well, Russia brought peace to Syria last year in that it averted a Western military attack, and Russia, 1 year on, has brought peace to eastern Ukraine. But Russia is damned if it does and it's damned if it doesn't. The problem for the West is that Russia is a strong country today. There was no issue for the West during the 1990s when Russia was on its knees and was subservient to the West and subservient to the IMF. But 20 years on, Russia is in a very, very different situation. So it doesn't matter if the ceasefire holds in eastern Ukraine. The West, led by the Americans and encouraged by the Americans, will do all in its means to try and bring about a situation where Russia is weakened dramatically in Europe, which would then result in Russia being dramatically weakened in the world. It's a game of chess that the Americans are playing, and they are not going to back off. Even if the ceasefire in Ukraine holds, and hopefully it will kick off again somewhere else, perhaps in Georgia, perhaps in Moldova. The Americans are intent on encircling Russia on its western borders.
We're hearing, as we might expect, that Moscow says it will retaliate with sanctions of its own. How painful could they prove to be for Europe?
Well, let's be clear about it. The Russian economy is going to suffer because the countries which are placing the sanctions on Russia, they're not poor countries, they're not obscure countries, they're some of the most powerful countries in the world. However, if Russia does retaliate, that will have an effect on those countries which are placing those sanctions. We've already heard very serious concerns in countries in Europe such as Britain, Spain, Germany, Czech Republic and Bulgaria about the effects on their economy of Russia placing sanctions on them. In Britain, for example, the company JCB, which is one of the biggest manufacturers of construction equipment in the world, has warned, the British government warned Prime Minister David Cameron about the detrimental effects that it will have on his company, because JCB has been supplying equipment to Russia for well over 30 years. So it's a very dangerous situation for those countries which are placing sanctions on Russia, and in particular European sanctions, because Europe is starting to show signs of coming out of the recession. These sanctions, should Russia place them back, which Russia would have every right to do, it's tit for tat, could have an adverse effect on that recovery for Europe.
OK, we do have to leave it there, but thanks very much for your thoughts. That was Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First. Thank you.